welcome to the CEC Report for March 31st. I'm Elisa Barwick and I'm joined today by Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Thanks, Elisa.
Today we're going to be discussing three items. Global bankers' dictatorship underway. Nations must reassert sovereignty before it's too late. Secondly, Nuremberg Code called for now. And thirdly, Middle East hair trigger again risks World War III. So firstly, global bankers' dictatorship underway. LaRouchePAC has issued this week a new report entitled Dodd-Frank Kills, How the US Joined the International Bail-in Regime. Now, Dodd-Frank is the bill that was passed in the United States after the global financial crash in 2010, which professed to re-regulate the banks in order to not allow the same kind of crisis to happen again. Now, actually, as we knew at the time, it was done in order to stop Glass-Steagall, which was getting a lot of support. And as we've now determined and we express in this report, it is literally the anti-Glass-Steagall. It's the opposite, the exact opposite of Glass-Steagall.
So what we're talking about, Elisa, with the Glass-Steagall is the legislation that Franklin Roosevelt proposed back in 1933 to deal with the same sort of speculative problem that they had back then, which was the fact that you had a depression brought about by the complete speculation, backed by the Bank of England, actually. So what Franklin Roosevelt did is he brought in laws to separate out the commercial banking system, which was necessary, from the merchant banking or the investment banking part of the banking system, and basically told them to get lost. And he brought in, he also separated out and broke down the banking houses, took out the insurance companies, the mortgage broking, the brokers, the stockbroking areas, and he actually created a healthy banking system. That's what we're calling for today with the Glass-Steagall, exactly the same thing.
Exactly, and Dodd-Frank does not do that.
No.
In fact, quite the opposite.
Doesn't even ring fence it.
Exactly. We began to look at Dodd-Frank more closely after the Cyprus bail-in, where there was a distinct shift in, okay, we can't do the bailouts anymore, we're going to do the bail-ins. Now, we discovered a report at that time written by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation in the US together with the Bank of England, which was called Resolving Globally Active Systemically Important Financial Institutions, or GCFIs. Or in other words, you could say the too big to fail banks. These are the ones that they can't allow to collapse anywhere in the globe. Now, this FDIC BOE report said this. It referred to legislative reforms already made in the UK and the US in response to the financial crisis, which provide new powers for resolving failed or failing banks, to impose losses on shareholders and unsecured creditors, not on taxpayers. Now, that referred us to Dodd-Frank because they referred to these legislative reforms that had already been made. And what we found was the existence of, not just in America through Dodd-Frank, but an international bail-in regime with the power to conduct what they call cross-border resolutions, meaning that they can come into your country. If you've got one of these GCFIs in your country, they can come in and they can conduct a resolution, they can surpass your local laws in order to loot the depositors of that nation to resolve that bank. Now, Craig, you put out a media release on this subject yesterday. What is the significance of this really for Australia and for the world?
Well, basically we have a $1.6 quadrillion derivatives bubble. That's 1.6 with 15 zeros behind it, of pure speculation, made up of 1.4 trillion of quadrillion of derivatives and plus another 200 trillion of stock market speculation and so forth. The intention of the banks is to first of all protect their system, their banks first and foremost, completely at the expense of the people. And what you saw in Cyprus, where the banks literally said, oh, well, we're going to take the depositors' funds and turn them into preferential shares, which mean nothing, actually, because those shares become worthless, is the intended model for the world in order to try and protect this ginormous bubble. Now, how's that going to be done? I mean, this bubble is so huge, it's impossible to try and do it. But I think, Elisa, one of the things that we've been looking at in the CEC this week is, is this some sort of an accident, or is this actually a deliberate, program? And I think, a lot of people say if you believe in conspiracy theories, there's no such thing as conspiracy theories, right?
Yeah.
Well, quite frankly, those people are nuts. Of course there's been conspiracy theories, and I think the biggest one has been what's been taking place amongst the financial oligarchy for hundreds and hundreds of years, actually starting in Venice and before that, and coming through the Dutch financial British empires and so forth. But the point is that if you go back to the 1920s, I think Carroll Quigley, the author of Tragedy and Hope, has made some really interesting comments about this. I mean, he's a round table insider. He's written a lot about the round table. And Elisa, we write about the round table as a British institution that's basically responsible for governing the British Empire back in the 19th century. And we go through this in great detail in A New Citizen. But what he is saying is that the likes of these legislations that are coming out from the Financial Stability Board, right, this is where it's all coming from, which is governing the global financial system at the moment.
And which is basically run by the Bank of England.
Which is run by the Bank of England, but it's part of the Bank of International Settlements, which is a really interesting organisation, because this Bank of International Settlements is something that Franklin Roosevelt wanted to get rid of after the war had finished, but unfortunately he died and we still got it. Now, with this Bank of International Settlements, I mean, you have to understand this is actually a bank designed by the financial oligarchy to bring about one world government through financial means, through financial speculation and so forth. And, you know, what Carroll Quigley writes about is something that I think people should hear, because this is not, you know, some sort of, you know, conspiracy theory with no merit. In fact, there's been a conspiracy for one world government for hundreds of years. It's the intention of the British Empire to have an empire, and to hell with sovereign nation states. What he says is very interesting, and I'll just read a couple of quotes. He says, in the 1920s, they, that is the private banker-run international cartel of central bankers, were determined to use financial power of Britain and the United States to force all major countries of the world to go onto the gold standard and to operate it through central banks free from political control, with all questions of international finance to be settled by agreements by such central banks without interference from governments. Now, look what we've got today.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. The central banks, the private banks are running the show. Where's our government, people? Why aren't they being challenged? Well, they were challenged.
And they're signing on to it. I mean, this FSB was created at the G20. Kevin Rudd was there. He was all for it. He was one of the key figures worldwide who pushed for the G20 to be the main body to deal with the global financial crisis.
Yeah. And let's come back to Quigley again, because, I mean, there has been fights in Australian history against this, what Jack Lang and Frank Anstey and others called the money power. They recognised it back then, this horrendous international web of international finance that controls sovereign governments. Now, what Quigley says again about in the 1920s and 30s, they were trying to control currencies by pegging it against the gold, right? And there was all sorts of manipulations, which is one of the reasons the US stock market crashed, is because there was a lot of speculation in gold. But that's just one aspect of it. But he says, in addition to these pragmatic goals having to do with the gold standard, the powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist system by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in infrequent private meetings and conferences. The apex of the system was to be the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's banks, which were themselves private corporations. Each central bank in the hands of men like Montague Norman of the Bank of England, Benjamin Frank of the New York Federal Reserve System, Charles Rist of the Bank of France, Helmer Schacht of the Reichsbank, sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans, to manipulate foreign exchanges, to influence the level of economic activity in the country, and to influence cooperative politicians by subsequent economic rewards in the business world. I mean, that's basically an exact carbon copy of what happens today. And what we're seeing with the Financial Stability Board, in terms of the controls that have now seen coming out, trying to control these G-SIFIs, is the same idea. This is a system being put in place to destroy the sovereignty of sovereign governments, to destroy the idea of Glass-Steagall, to destroy the potential for national banking, right, and to stop large-scale infrastructure development. And at the bottom root cause of this is actually going to be population reduction. That the intended program of the British Empire, as we've said many times in this program, is population reduction, of reducing the world's population from down below 7 billion to something like 1 billion people. You control the financial system through these monetarist means, as you know, for the intention of creating a one world government, i.e. one world empire, financial empire, but actually an actual real empire, and that's what, you know, that's what the result will be.
And it's revealed, like you said before, there's 1.6 quadrillion in terms of the obligations that ultimately this financial bail-in regime is intended to bail out. But as EIR has put together the figures, the total of the monies that could be collected in bail-ins and bail-outs by the end of 2014 at the current rates is 18 trillion. So 18 trillion compared to 1.6 quadrillion is just over 1%. I mean, it's a penny on the dollar of what you're actually trying to bail out. So it's not going to touch the sides, which reveals that the intention of this has nothing to do with bailing out banks. But as you said, this bailout is good really for only one thing, and that's destroying nations and killing people.
And that's been the intention for hundreds of years. And we've, you know, documented in our publications how this goes way back to Venice, and then through the, actually goes way back, you know, all through empires throughout history. That Lynn Larouche has talked a lot about, the continuance of empire, you know, from the Babylonian times to the Venetians to the British and Dutch empires and so forth. There's a continuity of the same idea of oligarchical control, where you have an elite few that think that they actually reign like the gods of Olympus, who treat human beings like human cattle. And this policy of monetarism is what exactly is being played out here.
Now you can look at our website for more of this information. We've run out of time for this segment, but we're going to talk more about explicitly this type of genocide occurring now after the break. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Nuremberg Code called for now. Now, as we were discussing in the last segment, we have genocide as a result of these financial bailout and bail-in policies occurring already, and I want to give a quick snapshot of what we've got across the world now.
That Nuremberg Code, just for clarity, that's the should have known,
yeah, knew or should have known.
Yeah,
When the Nazis were tried, many of them said, well, we were just following orders, we didn't know what it meant.
Right.
But the standard after that was, well, you knew or you should have known.
And this is where some of these Nazi doctors and so forth were jailed or executed, actually.
That's right.
So this is the context in which we're looking at this.
Exactly, that's what we're calling for.
Yeah.
So in Cyprus, there's an IMF report that came out this week, and it refers to the fact that the bailout policy, which is only just 2 months old, resulted in the wipeout of 70% of the deposits of Cypriots. And the IMF admitted in this report that this will have severe implications for any hope of economic recovery. You've just wiped out the population. Now in Italy, you've had a new book released by Giulio Tremonti, who's the former economics minister. In that book, he said that what we're seeing in Europe will take shape under emergency conditions into an unwritten form of financial fascism, what he called white fascism, and he said explicitly using the methods that we saw under Hitler. In Greece, we had back a couple of months ago the UN Human Rights Report, which declared that austerity policies, policies of liberalisation, privatisation, are a violation of human rights. And of course, we've also seen that the austerity measures did not reduce the debt. In fact, it grew. In the United States, there's been a book recently released called Why Austerity Kills, which has shown absolutely shocking figures on the skyrocketing of the rates of suicides, depression, homelessness, unemployment, diseases that we'd been on top of previously that have just skyrocketed since the GFC. In Portugal, we've had a leader, the Socialist Party leader, Manuel Alegre, who described Southern Europe as being like a concentration camp. It's people like prisoners lined up for the gas chambers. We're seeing the policies of environmentalism. 1 tank of biofuel, 50 litres, would feed an African child for a year. So we have policies in the context of a global food crisis that are killing people. Now, don't you think, therefore, that it is time that we invoke that Nuremberg standard?
Well, this. If you come back to the austerity policies, like for what we're seeing in Greece specifically, you know, where there's no more medical care, no more drugs to treat cancer patients. So young people are dying of cancer because there's no drugs, because there's no money for the hospitals to buy those drugs, and the entire system is collapsing. Now, this policy, this financial policy, is literally killing people, right? And any policy, and we have it in our own country, right? Where, and one of the interesting things, which we were discussing before we came onto the show, was the idea that, you know, that people over the age of 65 aren't going to qualify for this National Disability Insurance Scheme. So anyone over the age of 65 is written off.
Are they not worth it?
They're not worth it.
Why?
This is the same standard. And I think you'll find, look, in our country, things are much more subtle. Drugs don't get listed on the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. Right, drugs that could save people's lives. Why? Is because it could extend their life 1 to 5 years if they're chemotherapy drugs. Well, what the discussion is, well, these are expensive drugs, right? And therefore, why should we? What's 1 to 5 years worth of a person who's got cancer?
Especially if they're over 65.
And I think the disgusting thing is, this is what Bill Gates has just talked about when he's just come down here in the last week. That these people like Bill Gates and others, the whole Obamacare package actually puts a monetary value on human life, saying that, and they actually calculate it, it's called a QALY, which is...
Quality Adjusted Life Index.
Yeah, and now there's another one called a DALY, which is a Disability Adjusted Life Year, right? So they put a monetary value in, they calculate it and say, well, you're not worth funding. You're too expensive, you're too sick, therefore you're now scheduled to die. Yeah,
and Bill Gates is this great philanthropist, and yet this is what he said in an interview with the Washington Post last week. He said the way this is talked about is, what's a year of life worth? They call it a Disability Adjusted Life Index, the DALY. When you're running a poor country's healthcare system, he said, you can't treat a year of life as being worth more than, say, $200 or $300, or else you'll bankrupt your health system. So with few exceptions, he said, you do nothing for diseases like cancer, for example.
Well, that's what we're seeing in Australia. It's like through the back door, because of the drugs that are not put onto the pharmaceutical benefit scheme, or for other measures, pure lack of money, right, for hospital treatments, lack of beds, lack of infrastructure and so forth. And this is all a function of the global financial and monetary system. Because if you had a functioning country, you'd say that human life is absolutely precious. You don't place a value on it, and you make sure that people get the best possible health care that is possible. And you treat your nurses and your doctors and your hospital staff as the crucial, necessary infrastructure that we need to have a healthy, but also a sovereign country. Because if you're not a sovereign country, you treat your people like human cattle. And this crap that Bill Gates goes on with is treating people as if they're like human cattle. Like a farmer doing the sums on how much feed they're going to put into that cattle to keep that cattle alive, right? Yeah,
as long as Bill Gates doesn't talk about changing the economic system that created this, then he's a fraud. And we pointed that out. We intervened. We were out the front of the Q&A event on Tuesday night with a flyer, The Fraud of Bill Gates. Putting a dollar value on human life doesn't save people, it kills people. And what we have to destroy is this economic rationalist mentality. And in fact, when the Nazis were prosecuted, Dr. Leo Alexander, he prosecuted the Nazis. So he spent many hours looking through their testimonies, investigating all of this. He described the principle behind what led to the atrocities conducted by Hitler as rational utility. Right, so rationalising what we've got because we don't have enough money does not cut it.
And yet the entire monetary supply is governed by central banks, like the Bank of England, like I read through that quote in the previous section. This is an entire top-down control of an empire-based system.
Now, after the break, we're going to look at Middle East hair trigger again risks World War III. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Middle East hair trigger again risks World War III. Now, we just came out of a pretty shocking briefing with Jeffrey Steinberg, the counterintelligence editor of EIR, Craig, and he'd literally just got off the phone doing an interview with Iranian TV because of the confluence of events that are now bringing the Middle East again to the threat of a complete blow-up which could trigger thermonuclear World
And
War III.
it's already on a hair trigger for that too.
Exactly.
These are a bit shocking.
We've been warning of this for some time, as our regular viewers would know. Now, the immediate context for this, though, is that the Russians have confirmed, as you may have been hearing in the news, that they will deliver, some reports saying they have already delivered these weapons, the S-300s, to Syria as per a long-standing arrangement. This is not something new. Now, these are defensive weapons which are not designed for near-range domestic use, so they're not capable of being used against the rebels. But Israel has threatened to intervene to destroy them. Israel has said this is a threat to us. Now, there's been a number of interviews in which Israelis have discussed the fact that whilst they want to attack and destroy these weapons, they have to be extremely careful because they don't want to strike the Russian cargo planes or ships that are delivering the weapons. So they need to make such a strike after the delivery, but before the installation of such weapons. And the risk still remains because there are Russian technicians conducting the installation. There will be Russian operators manning these stations of defensive weapons. So it really risks an act of aggression against Russia. How would Russia react if their people were hit in such a strike? How would the US then react?
Well, this is why we're on trigger for World War III. I mean, of course Russia is going to react. I mean, Russia's played a crucial role, Elisa, in trying to protect the sovereignty of Syria against these coordinated attacks from the likes of the British through Obama, using the Saudis to supply the rebels that are the Al-Qaeda forces that are supposed to be the enemy of the United States. I mean, the point is that the intention of the financial oligarchy through the British Empire is to destroy national sovereignty. They did it with Libya, they've done it with Iraq, and now they're trying to do it with Syria. Russia is saying, no, this principle of sovereignty is crucial. They know that they are the target, actually, for a global World War III, and that's what they're concerned about in terms of protecting this principle of national sovereignty, right? It's a principle that China shares this principle as well, that through the principles of national sovereignty you can develop your nation. You don't need a financial oligarchy. You have sovereign credit systems inside your country. This is all a threat to the British system of monetarism that we discussed in our papers. So they're going to react as if they're attacked as a sovereign country if Israel does anything like that. And we've talked a lot about it on the show that this entire attack against Syria is not just an attack against a country, it's an attack against this principle. It's the responsibility to protect doctrine of Tony Blair, which has overridden this principle of Westphalia, of the advantage of the other. So this is a top-down battle for national sovereignty.
And there are American leaders who have warned against this.
Oh yes.
Including the chairman of the general chairman of the Chiefs of Staff.
General Dempsey.
Yeah, that's right. So what we risk, though, if something like this occurs, is that there's little time for cooler heads to prevail, so we have to act. Now, one of the key pathways is Glass-Steagall, because that diffuses the tense situation that the world is in right now. So what we'd like our viewers to do is go to our website, get the latest New Citizen, organise with this New Citizen, go to your leaders. We need to get Glass-Steagall through. Thanks for tuning in, and join us again next week for the CEC Report.